Now, the methods used to control, as I say, vary a lot. I want to talk for a few minutes about the most popular way that kids are controlled with counterproductive results. The word is punishment. But we don't like that word. It's so unappealing. We don't like to think of ourselves as punitive. So we generally prefer a euphemism, like consequences. Sometimes we even insert the modifier logical, because this allows us to punish kids with impunity. In other words, to feel better about ourselves for making kids feel worse. Punishment simply means that you say to kids something, or do simply do to kids, with or without the advance notice, that something bad is going to happen to you if you don't do what I want. Do this, or here's what I'm going to do to you. Something unpleasant, something aversive. Or the flip side of that, another version of punishment, is to say, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to prevent you from doing something you do want. The point being to change future behavior. In other words, punishment means that we are making kids suffer on some level and to some degree to teach them a lesson. You can call that punishment, you can call it a consequence, you can call it a popsicle. I don't care what you call it. What's important is the effect. Does it work? Well, I take a gun out of my pocket right now, and I shoot it at the ceiling to show you it's loaded. Bang! And I point it out here and say anybody in here who talks is going to get shot. And I convince you I'm serious. I've had a very bad week. I'm suffering from unbelievable jet lag, and my childhood wasn't great either. So the question is, do you shut up? And the answer is what? Yes, I think you do. See, punishments, or the threat of punishments, work. They work to get one thing, and only one thing ever: temporary compliance. But at terrific cost. And I want to say a bit about what that cost is. But even before you look at the research, there's some basic common sense questions that if you try to put aside all of the baggage we carry, the experiences we've had as children, what's expected by the people around us, and just ask, does this basic concept make sense? Ask yourself, does it seem logical to you that deliberately making your child unhappy would lead to positive results? Or ask yourself, if punishment is so darned effective, how come I have to keep doing it over and over again to my child? At what point does it occur to you to ask, is it possible that the problem is not with the child, but with the whole idea of punishment? Or you could ask, does it seem logical that we should raise our kids with what amounts to a childish quid pro quo? Because that's what it is, isn't it? I mean, if we said, oh yeah? Well, if you don't do all your homework right now, you can forget about going out this evening, so there. Without the, oh yeah, and so there, this is exactly what most books urge you to do. To think like, a little kid about, does it make sense? Well, put aside the common sense questions and look at the research. The Multi-University Conduct Problems Prevention Research Group in the year 2000 concluded that, quote, punitive discipline emerged as a common or shared predictor of all the dimensions of child disruptive behaviors. Yeah, exactly. A big Midwest study found that punishment of various sorts, quote, contributed more unique variants to predicting problem behavior ratings than all demographic predictors combined. In other words, put aside race, class, sex, age of parents, anything else. If you were trying to predict kids who were in trouble in various ways acting out, the main thing you'd want to look at is whether their parents used any kind of punishment on the kid. Somebody else wrote, parents who punished rule-breaking behavior in their children at home often had children who demonstrated higher levels of rule-breaking when they were away from home. Consistent with the idea that we just force the problems underground and add to the problems. Now, many of us understand now, though not everyone, that it is especially problematic to use a kind of punishment known as corporal or physical punishment, in which we physically hurt children by spanking them and the like in order to teach them a lesson. Here, the research is unanimous, or virtually unanimous, that the use of spanking and physical punishment leads to kids becoming more aggressive, more likely to be depressed, more likely to act out in various ways, more likely to grow up and raise their own children by hitting them, and so on. It teaches a lesson, absolutely, when children are spanked. And the lesson it teaches is the way to get your way with people who have less power than you have is by hurting them. I have to tell you that my value judgment on this is that as sickened as I am by men who hit their wives or girlfriends, I find it even more morally reprehensible to consider adults hitting children at any time and for any reason. But if you don't share that value judgment, I would hope that you would then look to the empirical data to find that corporal punishment simply doesn't work, isn't needed, and is likely to cause a range of problems and make things worse. It's not just ineffective, it is profoundly disadvantageous. But the main point I want to make this evening is that I'm not just talking about corporal punishment. I'm talking about all the other consequences. I'm talking about forcible isolation of small children. Oh, that sounds so unpleasant. What should we call that would make it sound more innocuous? Time out. What a lovely suggestion. That sounds terrific. Time out. You know where that came from, by the way? The origin of time out? It's originally short for time out from positive reinforcement, and was invented as a technique for suppressing certain behaviors in laboratory animals. That's the proud tradition of time out. So they would try the heirs of a guy named Boris Frederick Skinner. You know who I'm talking about? Man who did his research with rodents and pigeons, wrote most of his books about people, that B.F. Skinner. Where they found that by plunging the animals into darkness or withholding food, having a time out from positive reinforcement, that they would try to figure out how to get them to do whatever the hell the experimenters wanted them to do. Now, one interesting issue for me as I've thought about this is, what is the positive reinforcement from which we're giving them a time out when we send them to their rooms when they're misbehaving? Because we're not usually in the process of handing out lollipops when we suddenly stop, And it took me a while to figure this out, but the positive reinforcement in that soulless language of the behaviorists is our love. Timeout is the signal example of an approach to discipline known as love withdrawal. It is our approval and acknowledgement and attention and affection that we are shutting off in a desire to make kids jump through our hoops. And it can sometimes work as surely as spanking them or a gun in the short run, but with emotional consequences that can be comparable to the cruder or harsher versions. You actually have therapists running around telling parents, don't spank, use a timeout. In other words, don't make your kids suffer physically, make them suffer emotionally. Because punishment is all I've got to offer. The real question, of course, is how can I find somebody who has a broader vocabulary? Somebody who has a toolbox that doesn't involve techniques to make kids feel bad in order to get compliance. It doesn't matter what kind of punishment. Any kind of punishment tends to have a destructive effect. Announcing in advance how we plan to punish children. Now remember, if you do this, I'm going to do that to you, may salve our conscience, but it's just a threat. We're telling them exactly how we'll make them suffer if they don't obey, which, among other things, communicates distrust. It says, I don't think you will act correctly without this threat hanging over your head. And it leads kids to think of themselves as complying for extrinsic reasons. Even if it works, kids begin to construct a sense of themselves as the kind of people who would not do the right thing without punishment. Even a single example of this can have this effect. Although I'm not saying that if you sent your kid to her room once when she was 4, your kid is screwed up for life. I want to put it in perspective. I think, for example, that there is a huge difference between forgiving ourselves an occasional lapse on the one hand and not even recognizing that these strategies are lapses on the other hand. To gulp hard and realize this is stuff that when we can, we should avoid because they never help in the long run to help our kids turn out to be the way we would like them to be. The more that punishment fails, this is the part that never fails to strike me as remarkable, the more we assume the problem lies with either the child or with the specific implementation of the punishment. Either it means the kid is so darn obstinate, such a troublemaker, that we need to find harsher or cleverer punishments, or we simply assume that we have to punish in a different way. Maybe I shouldn't send the kid to the room at this point, but at that point. Maybe it shouldn't be for this many minutes, but for that many minutes. Maybe I should substitute, you're going to lose the following privilege instead of a timeout. Instead of taking a step back and realizing the problem is with the punishment itself. So now you may have to take my word for it temporarily tonight about the research overwhelmingly demonstrating the futility and destructive effects of any punitive consequences. Although I'm happy to point you to the original sources if you are appropriately skeptical. Take a moment to give me the benefit of the doubt, and let's try to figure out why it's true. Why does punishing kids, any kind of punishment, tend to have the effect of not working very well and being the most powerful single predictor to kids with problems? Here are a couple of possible suggestions. And again, what I'm trying to do here is merely explain the consistent findings of the research. First, punishment makes people mad, even really short people. It fills them with rage and a desire to get even, and then adds to that powerlessness pushed into their faces that they're unable to do anything at the moment with that rage. You know, what history teaches us about nations is what psychology teaches us about individuals. Those who feel like victims will soon become victimizers. Second, punishment teaches the lesson of power. Kids may or may not learn the lesson you intended to teach. Come home on time, keep your promises, don't lie, don't slug your brother, stop making a mess, don't talk back, whatever that lesson is. But the one lesson you may be sure they will learn from consequences is that when the most important people in their lives have a problem, they will try to solve it by using power to make other people unhappy, so they'll be forced to capitulate. That's the lesson of every timeout, of every go to your room, of every spanking. Third, punishment eventually loses whatever tiny bit of superficial effectiveness it once had. Those of you who are parents of teenagers know that at some point when you're saying to them, you're going to be grounded if you keep that up, they're going to laugh in your face. And then you're out of tricks. Because all you've been using to try to help kids to do whatever you wanted was threats. And now what if the threats don't work? It doesn't mean that your kids are just unbelievably obstinate and we have to think of cleverer or more severe punishments. It just means that there's an inherent problem with the strategy from the beginning of punishing them for doing bad things. Thomas Gordon, who invented parent effectiveness training 4 decades ago and who died just recently, once said, "The more you use power to try to control your children, the less influence you will have over their lives." I don't know about you, but I'd kind of like to have some influence over my kids' lives in the long run. I'd like them to turn to me for advice. I'd like them to spend time with me when they have a choice. The use of power and punishment of any kind makes that less likely. Here's another reason I think the research consistently shows, as does everyday experience if we're alert to the patterns and nuances, that punishment doesn't work, is that it erodes our relationships with kids. They come to see us as potential enforcers to be avoided instead of caring allies to be consulted. Pretty soon, we use enough of these consequences, and they're about as happy to see us coming as you and I would be to see a police car in our rear view mirrors, you know? And pretty soon, from the child's point of view, these kids are thinking, you know, these huge, all-powerful people on whom I'm totally dependent occasionally are making me miserable on purpose. These giants who hold me and rock me and feed me and kiss away my tears sometimes seem to go out of their way to take away things I like, or make me feel unworthy, or hit me on the backside even though they're always telling me to use my words, or talking to me in a voice that has all the love drained out of it. They say it's because of something I did, but all I know now is that I can't trust them completely or feel completely safe with them. So I'd be pretty stupid to admit to them when I feel angry, or that I did something bad, because I've learned I might be given a timeout or something else, so I better keep my distance. Another reason punishment tends not to work is because it distracts kids from the important issues. Let's say a kid kicks her sister really hard and makes her cry, and we say, you need a timeout. You need to go to your room and think about what you've just done. So let's look in on her sitting in her room. What is going through her head? Is she thinking, now I see that hurting people is wrong. It is literally laughably improbable. Why in the world then would we ever do it? What is going through her head? I hate my sister. I'm awful parents. Not only do I hate my sister, but watch how I'm going to get her when mom isn't looking. Anything else? Nothing potentially helpful is going through her mind, because punishment doesn't focus kids' attention on what I did, why it wasn't the right thing to do, what else I should have done. It gets them focused basically on just avoiding punishment. Hey, I don't want to catch you doing that again. She thinks, okay, next time you won't catch me. It hones their skills at escaping detection. And it also creates a strong incentive for kids to lie. That wasn't me. It was already broken. Kids are much less likely to lie in families where there is no punishment, because they're not going to be made to suffer. If they did something wrong, it's going to be a problem-solving solution to try to work with kids to try to make sure this doesn't happen again and get to the root of the problem, more about which coming up very soon. But when it's a punitive household, the kids lie, and then sometimes are punished for lying. Sometimes kids do this cost-benefit analysis. Well, if I'm caught, I'm going to be made, I'm lose, but I think it's worth it. And so the point is that they're not focusing on the important issues, which leads me to my last concern about punishment. It gets them focused not only on avoiding punishment, it gets them focused on themselves. Punishment is one of the two great ways we have to make kids self-centered. Because the question that they're led to ask in a punitive household, one with consequences, is, what do they want me to do, and what happens to me if I don't do it? That's completely different from getting kids to ask a question like, what kind of person do I want to be? In fact, the use of any consequences is a continuous and active distraction from getting kids to focus on questions having to do with the well-being of others. They're thinking about covering their own butts. That's it. I believe that moral development requires the complete elimination of punishment. It's not sufficient for it, but I believe it's necessary for optimal moral development. Anytime you say to kids, here's the bad thing that will happen to you if you don't do what I tell you, even if you have a perfectly reasonable request, children are not thinking about others. I was asked recently on a TV show, don't you believe in consequences? To which my response was, yes, I want to raise kids to think about the consequences of their actions to other people. That's exactly what is squeezed out by the use of traditional discipline, including punishment. The word consequences means consequence to you. And so naturally, that's all kids are thinking about at this point. You know, I'll put this maybe in a slightly surprising way to you. I don't want kids just to be taught at home that hurting people is bad. I want them to learn why hurting people is bad. There's a big difference there, because one possible reason for not hurting people is because if I get caught, something bad will happen to me. Another possible reason not to hurt is because if I hurt, it will make you feel terrible, and I don't want to make other people in general feel that way. If you are not attentive as a parent or a teacher to the reason for not hurting, and you punish them, then the default reason becomes naked self-interest. That is what every timeout, every spanking, every withdrawal of privileges teaches, naked self-interest. So why then is punishment so all-fired pervasive? If half what I've said, both in terms of the data and in terms of what I think are plausible explanations for those findings, are true, if even half, actually it's all true, but even if half were true, or you don't quite buy everything, why is it that punishment is everywhere? Interesting to think about. There are lots of possible explanations. Maybe one just popped into your head. Actually, why? Let's go through a few of them real quick. Why? Because it's another way? Oh, we don't know what else to do. Absolutely. Why else?
Short-term work, effectiveness.
Right. Short-term effectiveness. It seems if I say to you, this room doesn't get cleaned up, you're not going to the party, the room gets cleaned up. See, it works. Without our being attentive to the hidden or long-range costs. Why else?
It was done to us growing up.
Because it was done to us. Okay, and that's what we know. Something else?
Prepare them for the real world.
Prepare them for the real world. People are going to do bad things to you later, so the best way to prepare you is by doing bad things to you now. People really think this way about competition, about all kinds of things. It's sort of like saying, you know, there are a lot of carcinogens in the environment, so I'm going to feed my kids as many cancer-causing agents as possible while they're small. One more?
Which is easier than a complicated discussion.
It's easier than what I'm about to suggest in a couple of minutes. The distinction I find relevant here, if we have to draw a dichotomy, is between doing to parenting and working with parenting. And doing to parenting takes very little time or care or skill or talent or courage, because you never have to rethink your own requests. Whereas the working with, brace yourself, takes all of those things. And so we do the easy thing. You know, speaking of the answer that said it was done to us, that actually forks into at least two possible reasons. One is it was done to us, so that's how we learn to raise children, by the way we were raised, a simple matter of behavioral modeling. But there's another deeper possibility that the psychoanalyst Alice Miller explores. Basically what she says is that we are desperate, even on an unconscious level, to believe that what our parents did to us was always done with our best interests in mind. It is so important for us to believe that that we then grow up and do exactly the same thing to our kids as though to erase any trace of a doubt that that was really true. Interesting possibility to think about. But for whatever reason it continues, boy, does it continue. And the more it doesn't work, the more the fault lies in the children. Now, there are a couple of challenges I hear to this very quickly. I'm going to run through them in case they popped into your mind. The first one that I hear most often is the real world challenge. I call it sometimes the bank robber argument. It goes like this. Hey, I am sorry, but when kids grow up, go out in the real world, where are we raising our kids on? Neptune? I mean, anyway. They're going to learn that if they do something wrong, they get caught. If your kid grows up and robs a bank and gets caught, there's a consequence for that. They have to learn that now. You see the fatal flaw here, folks? We want kids not to rob banks because they know it's wrong. No consequence ever taught kids about wrong and right, only about power and self-interest. Use your imagination. This auditorium is filled with bank robbers. I guarantee you that most of them had plenty of punitive consequences when they were kids. They learned that the reason not to do bad things is you'll get caught. So if they think they're clever enough to evade detection, a punishment-oriented traditional childhood has given them a green light to go and do it. Are there adults out there who only stay within the law because they're afraid of what will happen to them if they're caught? Yeah. Are those the kind of people you want your children to grow into? If so, go for the spanking and the timeout and withdrawal of privileges and all of the other consequences. Here's another challenge I hear a lot. It gets their attention. Absolutely right. But what gets their attention is pain and the fact that someone on whom they are dependent caused that pain. In other words, the very features that make punishment impossible to ignore also make it almost impossible for any good to come out of it. Here's another one. But I'm doing it out of love. And I assure you, I believe that that is true in the vast majority of cases. I don't mean to make parents who punish kids out to be demons, uncaring of their kids. I assume, unless it's proven otherwise to me, that any given parent loves his or her child deeply and wants the best. But punishing out of love is very confusing because kids figure out that someone who cares for them is making them suffer, which leads to the warped and often enduring idea that causing people pain is part of what it means to love them. Try outgrowing that. Or it may teach them that love is necessarily conditional. You only get it when you're good, when people do what you want. And finally, I hear this, but I explain the punishment. I don't just do it to them. I tell them why I'm doing it so they can learn the lesson from it that I intend to teach. And my response to that is that explanation does not minimize the bad effects of punishment. Rather, punishment minimizes the possibility of any good coming out of explanation.